Meanwhile, in another part of the station, a very different family reunion was also taking place. Feeling the wish to not be quite so in the way, as well as the additional need to gain some distance from the rather tasteless art exhibit that they had passed on their way here, Moore had invited her children to follow her to a close-by establishment to sit down and talk together in peace. When she looked to the side now, she could see Admir and Coco stand a slight distance away, standing aside a bit at her personal request. When she listened very closely, she could just barely hear them talking into their communicators, presumably speaking to James and making sure he was alright, after he had broken away from the group to reach his scheduled appointment in time. "Alright, just be careful," she could hear Admir say seriously, before he paused to presumably listen to James's answer. Then he added, "Don't worry about it. Just let us know when we'll be there to pick you up. We haven't strayed far from the hotel." Meanwhile, when she looked straight ahead, she could see her children settling into their places at the large table. They shifted around a bit awkwardly, as they tried to get comfortable in the slightly unusual establishment, as the furniture here was formed a bit differently than at least two of them were used to. The no longer planet-bound Muin, of course, had plenty of experience with standardized furniture, and therefore barely batted an eye. However, both of his sisters seemingly needed a moment to fully adjust. And that wasn't even mentioning the specific quirks of this station, namely being the constant accompanying light show that seemed to be integrated into nearly every surface here on the one hand, and those responsible for said light show, the Lachaset Deathworlders, who owned and constructed this station, on the other hand. It seemed that, especially Humwa, appeared to be concerned about the tiny carnivores near omnipresence on this station, while her older sister Kenta looked less directly concerned, and more slightly irritated from being surrounded by such a large number of them at all times. Moore watched this with slight uneasiness, as it didn't sit right with her that her children would look with such emotions onto the people whose territories they had decided to travel into. However, what was gnawing on her much more than the reactions themselves was the knowledge in the back of her mind that she had been the one to instill such behaviour into her own children in the past, which was something that now ashamed her greatly. Still, besides those negatives buzzing around in her head like pesky flies, she felt undeniably and overwhelmingly happy to see her children like this, in the flesh and right in front of her. She had not entirely forgotten the last time they all spoke, and on what a sour note that conversation had ended. However, in all honesty, it hardly mattered to her that they had a mild fight in the past now that she got to see and touch them all again. The nervousness that it seemed all of them were feeling when they first approached her also seemed to be melting away now that she had gotten her first heartfelt greetings out of the way and regained control over her tears.
"Order whatever you like,"
she assured the three with a happy laugh, and gestured to the automatic menus that were laid out on their table for their convenience.
"We still have something to celebrate, after all, even if it is a bit prematurely. I invite you all to enjoy yourselves."
"We're not children, Mother." Kenta, of course, immediately tried to decline, Moore expected nothing else. "We can pay for ourselves." Moore just laughed it off.
"Yes, but I am still your mother. Besides, you are supposed to let old people have their little gratifications. You are not going to deny your old mother the chance to take care of you on one of the few occasions she can still do so, are you?" she countered, with a sly look on her face, and an almost challenging smirk at her daughter. Kenta seemed slightly taken aback at first, but then she sighed and looked down at the table. "As you wish," she sighed, and her bright fur hung off her neck in long waves as she lowered her head. She really did look a lot like her father in his younger years in that moment. "Well, I'm not going to complain about having Mama pay for me," Humwa happily announced, while she started to eagerly look at the menu. Moore smiled happily as she heard that. Her heart beat a bit lighter at that moment, as she realised that, although Humwa was finishing her studies and stepping into the proper world of adulthood now,
she still hadn't entirely changed from her little girl that nuzzled up to her at night because she was scared of the dark. The contrast in comparison was quite stark when Moore's thoughts wandered a bit, and she reminded herself that her youngest sitting in front of her here was about the same age as James was. Although she was unsure she should feel bad about thinking that way, Moore was secretly glad deep down that it was not her child who had been burned with the weight of the world like her poor friend was. Meanwhile, as his sisters were trying to decide what they would order, Buin was constantly a bit distracted by glancing over to his wife ever so often, either to check and make sure she was alright, or simply because he couldn't quite keep his eyes off her. After being first welcomed by Moore, Zarabi had now taken a seat slightly away from the reuniting family, presumably to give everyone some space, while still remaining close enough to possibly be interacted with if so desired, without the need to resort to screaming across the room. Moore wasn't quite sure if she agreed with Zarabi being isolated from this reunification, mostly because she wasn't quite sure if she was separating herself of her own accord, or if any of Moore's children had asked her to do so beforehand. And she wasn't quite sure which of those two options she would have preferred. After all, Zarabi was part of this family now, so there was no reason to draw this obvious distinction between Moore's children in blood and her daughter-in-law. But she would let it slide for now. In all honesty, she probably would have let most anything slide for now in that moment, because she was still so incredibly happy to just see her children sitting before her in the flesh. A bit later, all of them had ordered something for themselves, and now waited for their food and drinks to be delivered, meaning now was the time to have their full attentions on each other.
I must say, I really am so incredibly glad to see you, Moore admitted once more, entirely unabashed. The last couple of days and even weeks have been rather trying, I must admit. And after how our last conversation ended, well, it just added fuel to the fire of my doubts, to be so unsure if you all would have any lingering feelings about it.
Her children all fell quiet at the same time. For maybe a uniform minute, they all simply stared at her, while clearly fighting with themselves over what they should say to such an open confession coming from their mother. Finally, it was Humwa who spoke up. "It's pretty," she said a bit meekly, and glanced over at Moore, who looked back at her with mild confusion, and tilted her head to the side to look at her daughter more directly.
"What is, dear?"
she asked in a mild tone, not wishing to give her youngest any reason to regret speaking up, after clearly struggling to do so. "That's, blanket," Humwa said, and pointed to the cloak Moore used to slightly cover herself with these days, after it was made for her by the humans back when she first met them. Clearly her youngest was not quite sure what to call it. However, her eyes did have a slight twinkle to them, as Humwa pointed to the piece of quasi-clothing. "It's pretty. I like the flowers on it. And the ones in your fur as well." Moore looked down at herself for a moment, taking in the parts of her fur that were exposed to the world, many of which had been braided, or had small trinkets woven into it in some places. She remembered this sort of decoration had been a point of contention the last time she had spoken to her children. Therefore, she was all the more relieved now to hear those words coming from her youngest.
"Thank you, Humwa,"
Moore said, and took another look down at herself, also inspecting the floral pattern woven into her pseudo-cloak.
"They are quite pretty, are they not?"
Moore had grown a liking to the patterns, ever since she had started to carry them around with her. They expressed a certain delicateness that she quite enjoyed, because she knew these delicate, pretty things depicted there somehow flourished and strived even on one of the harshest death worlds that the galaxy knew. A small hint of hope and beauty to always keep in mind. Marine smiled and nodded at the exchange between her and Humwa, while Kenta looked the slightest bit uncomfortable at the topic being brought up. She had always been so strict. After smiling at Humwa one more time, Moore took a deep breath and let it out in a long exhale. Finally, she looked at all her children.
"Have you all come to try and take me away again?"
she asked them candidly, making sure her voice carried no judgment with it, as she looked at all of her children openly. Of course, the three flinched slightly as she brought the topic up. Moore wasn't quite sure if they had not expected her to possibly think that their intentions had not changed since their last call, or if they simply were not quite ready for the conversation that was about to ensue, despite being prepared for it. But ultimately, Kenta took the lead as the oldest. Clearing her throat, she gently spoke up. "We wanted to offer it to you once again, yes," she said, clearly carefully wording her answer, as her eyes still avoided Moore's for the moment. It looked a bit like she was tensing up right after she said it, almost as if instinctively preparing for a volatile reaction to quickly follow her words. "But after careful deliberation, we decided that, instead of calling another time, we would come to you directly and let you make the choice while talking to you face to face. After everything that has happened here, we are very worried about you, Mother, and we want to show that without making it seem like we don't respect you again." Moore had, of course, expected nothing else, and she didn't feel the need to react quite as harshly as Kenta seemed to have expected her to this time. She had had some time to think about it by now, after all. "I understand," she said. Things got quiet once again, as her children looked at her with big eyes once more. "You do?" Muin finally spoke up, with mild surprised confusion. Moore nodded. "Of course," she said. "Then," Humwa started to say, with a hopeful tone in her voice. However, Moore stopped her from saying anything further, with a gently raised claw. "I understand that you are worried about me." Moore then quickly began to elaborate on her words. "And I am glad. Honestly, I understand that I am walking a precarious line, in a potentially dangerous situation. I could not possibly expect of you to not worry. In fact, I am overjoyed that you do. It means even now in my elder years, when you have all long fled the nest, you still care about me. And I could never ask for anything more of you." She saw a mixture of hope and confusion form in her children's faces at that, before realization of where a sentence like this would usually lead slowly seemed to set in for them, turning their expressions into those of a little more concern. Humwa and Kenta both seemed to be a bit more stricken by it, leaving Muin to exhale deeply while putting on a mild smile. "So, you're still not coming back?" he assumed, in a tone that spoke of him also having spent a lot of time thinking on the matter, and having come to terms with it before he even came here. Moore shook her head. "No," she said, with that same smile still on her face. "I will not come home just yet, at least not permanently." Her children exchanged a few glances that covered a wide range of emotion. "Mother," Kenta finally said, "I understand that these people are your friends," she began to say, and very briefly looked over to the two humans still standing a bit off to the side before she continued. "But that shouldn't mean you have to—" "These people," Moore said, interrupting her daughter, and once again raising her claw up to indicate that what she had to say was important, "would not hesitate for a second to allow me to go home should I express the desire to do so. They are not keeping me here. Nobody has asked me to come along with them. When the prospect of the journey to the station came up, I was offered the opportunity to accompany them. Nothing more. In fact, if you would ask them instead of me, I believe wholeheartedly that they would fully agree that going home, or at least staying away from a place covered with such unrest, would probably be best for me. I do not think James would even think twice about it if you asked for his opinion. But I would still like to stay because, as you said, they are my friends,
and I would like to support them."
Her children all glanced at her as they digested her words. Then they all glanced at each other.
"And there is nothing we could do to change your mind?"
Kenta asked after a moment, with a less accepting and more resigned tone than Muin had.
"Oh, plenty of things,"
Moore chuckled amusedly, trying to take some of the tension out of the conversation.
"I assure you, just in a single moment I can think of hundreds of things you could do to immediately make me change my mind and hurry back home at your side, without even thinking twice about it. However, I do not believe any of them are measures that you would actually be willing to reach towards, in your efforts to convince me."
All three of them looked confused for a moment. However, from over at the other close-by table, Moore could hear Zarabi chuckle under her breath.
"Wow, dark."
So, apparently, at least she had caught on to Moore's meaning. Moore began to really like that girl by now.
"So, what you're saying is,"
Kenta said, and this time she purposely cut herself off before Moore could do it, willfully leaving it to her mother to finish the sentence for her in this case. Moore nodded and smiled.
"What I am saying is, you three will always be the most important thing in the universe to me. Nothing is ever going to change that. If you ever need me, you need not say more than a word, and I will be there at your side. All consequences be damned,"
she explained, and put her heart and soul into those words, to leave no doubt of her being nothing but absolutely genuine.
"But as long as I know that you are all okay and need for nothing, that means I can focus on other things. And I just know you are all going to be all right. And because I know that, I am at peace with helping out my friends, instead of going home with you, because, clearly, they can use all the help they can get."
Her children were apparently making it a habit now to blankly stare at her, after almost everything she said, because, once more, Moore found herself looking into three puzzled faces. After a moment, some of them even began to scratch along the fur of their faces and necks, running their claws through their long strands of hair as they thought.
"And you really think helping them is the right thing to do?"
Kenta finally asked after a while, and her voice carried surprisingly little judgment with it. The inquiry sounded rather honest. Obviously, some of Kenta's own thoughts on the matter couldn't quite help but leak over, along with her words, as worry and uncertainty about the current state of the world seeped into the question like a foul odour, quickly permeated an entire room. But ultimately, Moore could tell that she did not ask it maliciously.
Well, you often told us to beware of specifically people like them and the ones that they're associating with."
She looked very uncomfortable, and Moore could quickly tell it was because of what she saw on the news. What she saw James state openly to the world, while the galaxy's eyes had been directly on him. He had allied with many a people's sworn enemy confidently, and completely unabashed. And it was no wonder that Kenta felt uncomfortable with that, because, after all, she was right. Moore, like so many other mothers, had often cautioned her children with tales about many things. About predators, about Deathworlders, about things that were unnatural, and, most of all, of the threatening force of destruction that were the realized. She had taught them of the rules and regulations that were in place because of such people and beings, and why they were put in place because of them, and why she had thought back then that that was a good thing. She couldn't deny it. Those used to be her words, her lessons, and her children had taken them to heart. It was no wonder they were now trying to apply those very same lessons to their mother. It was what they knew.
"I did,"
she therefore confirmed for Kenta.
"I was often scared for your safety back in the day. Scared of things that I feared may harm you. And in my fear, I have taught you many things that I now wish I could take back."
She paused for a moment, and needed to look away for a bit before refocusing on her words.
Of course, I would never advise you not to be cautious, especially in a case like the one we currently find ourselves in front of. Real lies can be, and often are, extremely dangerous. That much is no secret, and I would never fault anyone for keeping that in mind. But we cannot deny that this case is, at the very least, different. The Miat do not fear that realized, and they have lived and worked with her for years. There were no signs of hostility from her at any point. The reason we fear realized is because of their ruthless and uncompromising ways, in addition to their overwhelming power. But don't we have to admit it to ourselves when we're being just as ruthless? After all, Aveslon did absolutely nothing to provoke an attack on her, such as the one that has happened, except for existing. And yet someone broke one of our galaxy's oldest and most important laws, while also endangering many innocents, just to try and take her life.
She explained the things that went on in her mind about the topic. Finally, she sighed and added,
I do not know if I trust Aveslon. I cannot deny it. Her very nature is still forming a pit deep in my stomach whenever I even think about her. However, when I force myself to think about it logically, then I simply must admit that, when it comes down to it, she has given me far more reasons to trust her than those who directly oppose her did. And many of those I trust seem to trust her. Therefore, yes, I believe supporting my friends is the right thing to do, especially because many of them suffered under the very things that are said about the people like them, that I for so many years blindly repeated, and even passed down onto you.
The speechlessness of her children seemed more genuine this time, more complete. It seemed like none of them had expected such a confession to be made, and apparently none of them could find the words to react to it. Eventually, Kenta exhaled slowly.
I understand, she uttered.
It was unclear if that meant in any way that she agreed with what Moore had said, based on the tone of her voice. However, Moore couldn't ask for any more than her understanding. She appreciated her daughter not treating her like a senile old fool, just because what she said most definitely fell out of most polite norms that she used to pride herself on, and that her daughter still seemed to quite strictly follow.
But do you really think they need your help?
Humwa then suddenly asked quite openly, and her youthful curiosity was written all over her face. There was almost a sense of hidden pride to the question. Maybe a bit of admiration for her mother trying to help change the galaxy. Moore could only chuckle as a reply.
Well, I am under no illusion to be of a significant amount of help. I am neither a good protector nor a particularly skilled politician or negotiator. I cannot directly sway the tides of conflict in any significant way,
she freely admitted to both her children and herself. However, then, she started to fiddle her claws together for a moment and looked down at the table's plate as she reflected on some things. Ultimately, she looked up once more, directly into Humwa's eyes.
But the people that are at its front, yes, I believe they need my help. They need any help they can get.
She reached an arm out across the table to reach for Humwa, who quickly extended her own arm, so that her mother could put her claws on it.
James, the ambassador that you all know from the news, and who briefly greeted you earlier, the man who announced his allegiance with Realized recently, and already lost his arm to this conflict before it had even truly begun, he was about your age, Humwa, Mornan explained gently.
She wasn't sure if Humwa had been somewhat aware of that fact, but with Moore stating it so directly, and putting things into perspective like that, her daughter's eyes widened slightly as it truly sank into her mind.
And he's facing opposition on the daily. At least half of the galaxy is against him, and every day he is confronted with a new group of people who yell or shout or make mockeries of his name or image. And those are just the more civil ones. He is not alone, of course. Many people fight this battle behind the scenes, doing so much more work than one person could ever get done. However, he is still at the front of it. For many people in the galaxy, he is the very face of this conflict in a way, and while it gained him a lot of admiration for sure, the opposition is simply felt so much more clearly at all times.
Briefly, Moore glanced back. She couldn't see it, of course, but she still glanced in the direction where she knew that mocking memorial to be, where the memory of the dead had been deliberately weaponized, but sadly directed at the completely wrong people.
And it is not just him. Almost all who stand at his side are far from home, in a galaxy that is widely hostile to them,
she then explained further, and shifted her gaze slightly to Admir and Coco, who seemed to be quite busily preoccupied with some sort of message that had reached them while this family reunion was happening. Those two were also still so young, yet she knew that they had already fought more in their short lives than Moore herself ever would.
I just want to stay at their side. Back when all of this started, I admittedly did not exactly smatter myself with glory. Many of the things I did and said back then were less than helpful with the benefit of hindsight. But I would like to believe that I have learned and grown, and that I may now offer my compassion and experiences to those who can desperately use all the support that can be granted to them. I may not turn the tides of conflict by myself in even the smallest way, but maybe I will get the chance to save a soul, or maybe more than one, and if that is even an option, I think it makes it worth me staying a bit longer.
After Moore finished speaking, Homewood gently and wordlessly swiped her mother's reassuringly extended claw away from her arm and started to stand up. For a second, Moore was afraid that she had said something to upset her somehow. However, Homewood simply quickly walked around the table in order to quickly wrap her long arms around her mother. Moore was surprised by this, but quickly reciprocated the hug. Homewood pressed her head sideways against her mother's chest for a while, without saying a word. Eventually, it became clear that she was very quietly weeping and huffing against some brewing up emotion, quite obviously trying to contain herself before she would once again try to speak. Moore just as wordlessly comforted her for a bit. After a while, Homewood lifted her head, seemingly ready to speak up again.
I'm really worried about you, Mama, and I really want you to come home,
she stated at first, and paused right after, seemingly waiting for that statement to sink in first.
I know, dear,
Moore replied gently, and ran her claws through her daughter's hair. Homewood swallowed audibly, and briefly sobbed once before catching herself again and continuing.
But if you're not coming home, I want you to know that I love you, and that what you're doing doesn't change that, even if you don't want to come home, she added, briefly broken up by sobbing once more, before she found her voice.
Moore quickly wrapped her arms around her tighter, and leaned her head against her daughter's, so their horns pressed against each other.
I love you too, dear, and I promise my decision to stay does not mean that I love you any less. I will still always be there for you, and of course I will still be there for your ceremony, she said, while squeezing her daughter tightly. Across the table, she could see Muin tilt his head slightly, with an almost amused expression on his face. You really are determined about this, Mother, aren't you?
He asked, in a tone that seemed to have already found closure with what was happening, despite an air of underlying worry remaining.
What can I say? I guess I am a mother through and through,
Moore chuckled, her voice slightly swelling up with emotion now that she was holding her youngest so close.
I simply cannot help myself when I am feeling needed.
Muin exhaled strongly, his nostrils flaring in the process.
If that's the case, then... Well, since Homewood's ceremony is happening quite soon, would you maybe mind if we stayed for a bit longer as well, so we can all fly back together when the time comes? He offered,
in a tone that made it clear he was probably intending to do just that, no matter what her thoughts on the matter would be. Moore perked up for a moment as she thought about it. Of course, she was happy about the prospect to have her children around a bit more, but...
Children, you know I would usually love it if you stayed. However,
she began, but was then interrupted when Kenta lifted a claw and said,
That would be a bit too dangerous.
Her gaze was almost smug as she stared at her mother, who was frozen with her mouth open for a second after being called out like that. Moore closed her mouth.
Why did you have to inherit my sass?
She chuckled to herself, and slowly shook her head.
We'll be fine, Mother. We are adults and can look after ourselves,
Kenta then assured her with a serious expression. Moore looked back at her for a moment, and she wanted to protest. However, in the end, she thought about the many mistakes that so many parents of those she surrounded herself with had made.
You are adults,
she therefore confirmed with a nod.
You are free to do as you please. If you stay, I will be delighted to be in your company ever so often. But please be careful and aware of the possible dangers.
Her children all smiled and nodded at her, and Homework pulled her tighter into the hug yet again. As she did, Moore's gaze was turned around towards the humans for a moment, and although their faces were covered, their demeanour spoke of concern as they looked and spoke into their communicators. Worried something may have happened during James's meeting while he was alone, Moore quickly spoke up, switching from her native tongue to GU for the first time in the entire conversation.
Excuse me, you two, but is everything all right? You seem worried, she asked directly,
causing the eyes of almost everyone around to turn towards the addressed humans, who looked up in mild surprise at being spoken to. They glanced at each other for a moment, and Coco quickly shrugged, leaving Admir to turn and take it upon himself to answer. We'll probably need to pick James up and head back a bit prematurely. Apparently something has happened with Curie.